So I outlined in the book something that I call the Productized Pathway. And it's a modified version of principles that you see in lean startup, that you see in design thinking, adapted for more mature, again, B2B services organizations who are new to using technology to scale. So it's really kind of foundationally built on that lean startup principle of build, test, and measure, and taking, like I said, a very iterative approach. So developing hypotheses around what we think the market needs, what we think the opportunity is, coming up with little tests to test those hypotheses. And those tests could be, very low tech tests just to see if the market appetite is really there, if the product value proposition is strong. Doing a minimum viable product to see how people use it, assess feasibility. Doing some customer acquisition experiments to see how hard it's going to be to acquire customers. Did we get the willingness to pay assumptions correct? And then taking all that learning and starting over again and just making it a learning loop, so to speak. And that's really what I outline.
Welcome to the B2B Digital Marketer Podcast, a podcast helping you to end your struggle with digital marketing, helping you to pave a new and better path to target and capture your ideal customer. Each week, we teach you how insiders and experts debunk the dreary and become engines of innovation. Now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Okay, B2B DM gang. Today I'm excited because we're going to talk about something that can really impact your revenue. Here in the past, 24 months, I've seen an explosion of the positions of chief revenue officer within a lot of organizations. And this is one of the main factors that we're going to talk about here today is how do you take, and really create and then implement additional revenue streams through your professional services in B2B. And the person who's going to help guide us in that discussion is here today, and also an author of a recently published book called The Ultimate Guide to Turning Your Professional Services into Scalable Products. And the main title is Productize. So that's the subtitle. And I have Aisha Armstrong with me. Aisha, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. I'm so happy to be here.
I tell you, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So for me, as I was going through and looking at the book and, the frameworks and the mistakes, and I'm like, oh yeah, been there, done that. And then also gave me an opportunity to see some pathways forward. And we'll even talk about some pathways, right? But before we go into that, can you tell the B2B DM gang a little bit about yourself and your background and your experience in this area?
Sure. Yeah. So personally speaking, I currently live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a mom to 2 teenage boys. I grew up in a small town in Kansas. But after I got my undergrad at University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I spent the next 15 years in product development, product management, and product leadership roles for a information services company that then adapted to offer data as a service and software as a service products. So I did that. And then I spent a couple of years working for a large media company, teaching them how to do new product innovation and development around data as a service products. And then about 3 years ago, I went out on my own and co-founded a boutique product innovation consultancy. And our focus is all on B2B services companies who are trying to use technology to productize their services so they can grow, so they can scale, improve their margins, all that great stuff. So that's a little bit about me and my background.
Well, and thank you for sharing that. And I think it's really important, like we had talked about, is, B2B organizations, like so many other organizations, were hit hard, through COVID, and many of them are still, relying heavily on relationships they had prior to that happening to us. You can't survive, unless, you do some innovation. So when you start looking at the organizations that are trying to essentially implement what you're talking about. Can you kind of give us a profile of what they look like?
Yeah. So these are organizations who have some type of intellectual property that they want to monetize, productize. And this intellectual property could be content, it could be data, it could be a methodology, an algorithm, but they want to use technology to take it to a broader audience. So a great example could be an advertising agency. And they have a data set that they use that they've built over the years, and a special algorithm that they use to help their clients with media planning, for example. And they use this as part of their customized engagements with their clients. They may see an opportunity to take that data set and take that methodology and turn it into a product that perhaps a more price sensitive segment of the market could access through a portal and use on their own to do their kind of DIY media planning. So that's kind of a great example of taking something that may be, like I said, intellectual property that you're using in a one-to-one service, and using technology to reach a broader audience and create a product that has better gross margins.
Well, even when you're talking about that, I even start thinking about, let's turn that lens a little bit, and I'm an organization that is heavy technology. And when you start looking at today's organizations, being more lean, maybe even having some skill gap issues, wanting to go down their growth path and maybe don't have some of those resources, I may be able to take things that are just pure play tech, and then actually create, some pro services around it as well. Isn't that another lens to look through?
It's totally technology to services. Absolutely. That's another way to look at it.
Well, and I know, we'll talk about the different types of products, because I think that's really important, because I think your work can be leveraged by a lot of organizations. And if I only look at it from, hey, I'm a pure services play, and I now want to tech enable and move up a particular ladder, I think that's a pigeonholing. Because one of the things for me, when you look at something that's vitally important into being successful, is the creative thinking and innovative and testing elements in all of this. And I think all organizations can become better at that.
Yes.
Okay. So
absolutely.
when I start thinking about the different types of B2B productization opportunities, can you please explain what those are?
Yeah. So it first starts with services, right? And that is, I'm doing something bespoke, customized for Jim, just for Jim, and it's delivered using arms and legs. And I would call that services. Then you kind of move up the ladder to what I call productized services. So I still, delivering something for Jim, but it's a suite of features or components, usually bundled with a name, and it has a set price point or price points based on the features that are included, but it still may be delivered by a person. So a great example could be, there are lots of organizations out there, consulting organizations that have certain engagement types, and they have names, and there's a set price schedule, and you just pick what flavor you want of those engagement types. Then you go up to products, and a product could be as simple as a book, right? Like a book is a product. It's something I buy one time. It could be a conference that I attend. It could be a benchmarking report that I purchase. It could be a piece of software that I purchase. It could be a data set that I purchase, but it's a one-time. And again, it's got a name, it's got a defined set of features. And what Jim gets is the same thing as what Bob gets, is the same thing as what Mary gets. The last thing, and where a lot of organizations are trying to go, is some type of product as a service. So it's delivered on a subscription basis. It's always on. I'm getting a steady stream of updates to it, maybe a steady stream of data, new content. And that's great because it has wonderful revenue visibility.
Okay, so when I start thinking about that, it gets into the holy grail of MRR that people are trying to get, that monthly
Totally,
recurring
yes.
revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get a whole different set of elements associated with client success and the retention. And, you actually start going into a lot of all of that as well, because, in order to look at that pathway, and some can even look at some synergies associated with creating value ladders as well. And again, when I went through the book and I started looking at this, I'm like, this has several different types of applications. It's not just the pure play, services to product path. It's also product to services or a blend path, because a lot of organizations know that, with the constraints and issues on my clients, if they're not able to use the tech, they're not going to renew. Right. So there's all these other different elements that come into play. But you talk about there's common mistakes that people make when they're actually trying to, go through this productization process. So you identified 7 of those mistakes. So what are the 7 deadly productization mistakes that you've identified?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So the first one is starting too big or too perfectly. So you kind of think about, the end goal, and you just focus on that end goal and nothing kind of smaller in between. So starting too big or too perfectly is mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 is focusing on processes rather than people. And what I mean by that is thinking like, if I've got, the perfect, design sprint process or innovation evaluation process, then I'll have no problem. But you also need the people with the right skills. You need a culture that encourages new product innovation. You need appropriate performance measures, all of those things. So that's really important to remember the people component. Mistake number 3 is favoring core businesses rather than new products. And certainly, we want to protect the core, perhaps even grow the core. But in order to make sure that we're not disrupted ourselves, either by competitors or new forces, COVID was a huge disruptor. It's important to continue to experiment and look at new things. But if we're not investing enough in new ideas, if we're holding those new ideas to the same performance measures that we hold our core business to, we won't be successful. So that's the third mistake. Mistake number 4, mistake number 4 is developing products that don't solve an urgent and expensive problem. And this is one that I see time and time again. And it's what I call solutions in search of a problem to solve. So you've got a piece of intellectual property, for example. You think, of course, there's a product here, but you haven't actually asked yourself, does anyone need this? Is there a real customer problem that it solves? Next mistake is designing and developing in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is it could be internally, like as a product manager, I come up with an idea and I just throw it over the wall to my development team and I don't give them any context. But it could also be not bringing in users and buyers and making them part of the design process. So that's mistake number 5, I think we're on. Mistake number 6 is fear of cannibalization. And this is, again, one, people are concerned about cannibalizing the core business. So they don't want to introduce any product that might cannibalize services or other products. And they end up getting disrupted by somebody else because they don't disrupt themselves. And then the last mistake is stopping at the minimum viable product. So I see a lot of organizations think they get the first version out there, and then they don't invest any additional money in getting feedback from the market and then continuing to iterate on that. So innovation is an iterative process, or at least it should be. And that means you have to make sure that there's enough powder left over to continue to iterate on that product and release version, 1.1, 2.0, 3.0, and so on.
Well, I think, we could probably think about our own, situations and scenarios when we start talking about, of those 7 mistakes, which ones are the most common and the most, crucial or vital. But, you're seeing this across a lot of organizations. So if I start talking about like the top 1 or 2 productization mistakes, which ones are they?
Yeah. So number one is developing a product that doesn't solve an urgent and expensive customer problem. Again, people fall in love with their existing intellectual property. They think because one client wants something that many clients want it. They think because a competitor is doing something that it means that customers must need it without actually doing their research to see if the competitor is successful. So that is probably the top mistake that I see, is just developing products, spending money on things that nobody wants or needs. The second one is that cannibalization fear that I talked about. And this shows up with kind of underinvesting in sales and marketing for it, not putting their best talent behind the go-to-market for it, walling off certain customers so they won't even expose them to the fact that this new product is out there. And that, again, is just a recipe for being disrupted by somebody else.
Well, as you're talking, I start thinking about the age-old, human bias issues, right? Hey, seen that, done that, we tried that before. All those things that come into play. And a lot of times you have people who are in a position of power that are the ones that are squashing a lot of these things. So I start seeing certain people's faces in my past. Sometimes it's my own in the mirror. When I start talking about things that I've squashed, or, things that get squashed. And so I start thinking about, well, how do I go through? I'm sitting here, I'm in an organization, I'm maybe a creative thinker. I want to do something. I want to help our organization to be more successful because I have some loyalty. I don't want to just, walk away and, go to the ones that are the disruptors. I want to make a difference. How do I go about doing that?
Yeah, good question. So I outlined in the book something that I call the Productized Pathway. And it's a modified version of principles that you see in lean startup, that you see in design thinking, adapted for more mature, again, B2B services organizations who are new to using technology to scale. So it's really kind of foundationally built on that lean startup principle of build, test, and measure, and taking, like I said, a very iterative approach. So developing hypotheses around what we think the market needs, what we think the opportunity is, coming up with little tests to test those hypotheses. And those tests could be, very low tech tests just to see if the market appetite is really there, if the product value proposition is strong, doing a minimum viable product to see how people use it, assess feasibility. Doing some customer acquisition experiments to see how hard it's going to be to acquire customers. Did we get the willingness to pay assumptions correct? And then taking all that learning and starting over again and just making it a learning loop, so to speak. And that's really what I outline. And what I've tried to do with the book is provide stories and case studies of how organizations, real companies, have used these tools to successfully pursue a productization strategy, and then also provide tools and templates that people can use to do this themselves.
As you're talking, I start thinking, for me, about that whole, pushing the rock up the mountain, right?
Yep.
Sisyphus trying to get the organization to move, and I start. For me, this is with my knowledge of what I know and the things that I try to focus in on. I'm starting to think about that place to start. If I am inside, or even if maybe I'm at the top of the organization, right? And because I still have to get, my entire organization to buy in, and maybe the organization is just me. Right. That could be the case too. Is I start, going and looking at that whole, solving that fundamental marketplace problem, the thing that's a big pain that, people are trying to solve for. And here's the thing I also find too, is that a lot of those people who are experiencing that don't even see it themselves. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it's like that old quote from Ford: if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, not a car. And so that's why when you're trying to assess, is there a real customer need? You don't ask about solutions. What do you need, right? You ask kind of what's challenging about mobility, for example, getting from point A to point B. Why? And then you do the 5 whys. You can really get to the root cause of what's challenging. And then ultimately, it's your job to creatively ideate and think of potential solutions, and then go back and test those solutions. So yeah, you bring up a good point that people don't always know what they need. And they usually, what they'll say is the problem is the symptom, not the root cause. So that's why you have to put your scientist hat on and really dig deep and try to find that root cause in order to develop a great solution.
So for me, one of the things, and this is where I think your insight and expertise is so valuable, in order to be able to, solidify and understand, that fundamental marketplace problem, it's the unmet and misunderstood needs that for me, I've tried to get better at being able to get to and thinking about it from that whole human perspective, not the product perspective. Yeah. So if you can tell us a little bit about how you've been able to really go about evolving, and then therefore, going through and expanding that identification of those fundamental marketplace problems in that context.
Yeah. Ultimately, it gets to going out and talking to people. So there's a lot that you can learn through analyzing data, right? You can see, perhaps how people are interacting with existing products. If you're doing A/B testing, kind of what messaging is resonating. And that's certainly good hygiene in trying to assess customer needs, because you're looking at real behavioral data. You can also certainly survey, right? And get, survey responses again. But I think there's no substitute for that ethnographic research where you're actually observing people in their environment, watching them go through, whatever kind of task it is that you think there might be a need around, and then just talking to them and really, really listening. So, that old adage of like the 80-20, and you want to be listening 80% of the time and only asking questions 20% of the time is really true when doing this. Now, I think what some people think when they think about doing upfront market research on customer needs is that this is going to take a long time. And certainly it does take, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. It does take some time, but there are ways now to do this research that it doesn't need to take a lot of time, just a matter of like a week or two, as long as it's part of your process. Like it's a continuous discovery process. So it's not just upfront market research and then we go away for 6 months and develop a product, but we do upfront market research. We come back 3 weeks later, ask a couple more questions, maybe design a prototype, get some more feedback, get together some alpha customers, have them test the product. It's more, so it's like, it has to be a continuous process of getting that feedback from customers. And again, in a way where you're observing how they're using it, you're really listening to them talk about their pain points, and doing that, like I said, listening 80% of the time, only talking 20% of the time.
Well, and even when you're mentioning that, I start thinking about the sources and the way that I do that. And that whole survey thing, I think, is a trap too. Like you said, you'll just get a bitter, faster horse.
Right. Yeah.
You gotta be careful. Because I've definitely seen, things constructed in a certain way. I'm like, well, you're going to get the answer you want because of the way that you've constructed it. Right.
Right. Totally. Yeah. So you need somebody who's really good at survey design if you're going to use surveys. Yeah.
Most definitely. And then also looking at my sources of that continuous improvement, I think about people who are not using product. Right. Mm-hmm. Maybe they don't even really know us very well. They're not users, and those that are, I think you have to look at your pool of where you're, fishing, as a really important strategy, because it goes back to that whole bias thing, right? If they already know us, they're going to respond in a certain way. Well, if they use one particular, service solution or product, or they've been with us for a certain period of time, they're going to respond in a certain way. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people to separate.
Yeah. Usually when we're doing market research, we always advise a little bit of existing customers, but a lot of prospective customers, and thinking about the different segments and ideally sampling across all of those segments.
So when I start thinking about the productized pathway, and you're talking about this, I started thinking about timelines, and I'm like, oh, we have a scenario where something forced, us to make changes and advances. And I talked early on about all of a sudden I started seeing these titles of, chief revenue officer and all that. And it's like, so some companies are in a, very, precarious position, and have a whole lot of stress. And it's like, I ain't got 48 months to figure this out and then find out. So I start thinking about the express version of the productization pathway. And I start thinking about, we say fail fast, we say identify fast, but then you say also, well, don't quit too quick on your, minimal viable product. And it becomes quite confusing.
Yeah.
So, if I start, thinking about expectations to set for myself, what can I really start telling myself as far as, what am I going to get from a return perspective versus the effort that I put in?
Yeah. So great question, Jim. One CEO told me prior to COVID, he was trying to get his company on Microsoft Teams for 18 months, and it just wasn't working. COVID hit, they had fully converted in 3 days, right? So there was a burning platform. Now, we don't always have that burning platform to get our organization to change behavior or adopt technology, get our customers to change behavior, perhaps adopt new ways of doing things like COVID. But there are a lot of really proven techniques out there to get us to learn quickly. And that's what I'm after, is learning quickly. So like a classic design sprint, usually if you've got a consumer product, you can do that in as little as a week. And you can have a prototype where you've already gotten feedback on it, and whether or not you're going down the right path or not. B2B, that takes a little bit longer, especially if you want to get buyer feedback and you're selling to C-level executives. But we've done those in as fast as 4 weeks. And again, what I'm talking about is ideation all the way to a prototype with buyer and user feedback in 4 weeks. We've had to make go, no-go decisions where we're putting together pro formas for board investment decisions in as little as 6 weeks. 8 to 12 weeks is preferred, but again, it can be done really quickly. And this is all about that. I mentioned that mistake of starting too big or too perfectly. When you start small and you have small learning loops, you can do those very quickly, versus if you have this big idea, it's going to take you months and months and months to decide if you're on the right path or not.
Well, and I think that's maybe what you started talking about in the book when you said the productization pathway, you don't necessarily have to approach it all at one time.
Correct.
And so elaborate a little bit more about that. Tell us more.
Yeah. So, what I outline in the book is kind of the soup to nuts. If you're productizing, here's all the way, starting with what's our strategy? How much are we going to invest to successfully launching and managing a new product? But along the way, you're doing lots and lots of, again, learning. And you've got lots of hypotheses. You're testing those along the way. And that will help you evolve your idea so it's ultimately one that's successful and will launch successfully. So no, you shouldn't be doing it all at once. You need to start at the beginning. How much are we going to invest in exploring this? Start ideating, start testing, then start designing.
Well, I think one of the things I often find, just think about it from even me from a personal perspective, and how I've had to shift some of the things that I actually dedicate effort and time to is, you can't do this as add-on work to something else. So totally. In other words, if I'm already working, 50, 60 hours a week, it can't become 80. And then I just put this in here. Talk to a little bit about that. Because to me, if you don't, dedicate, carve out, do something that's specifically focused, on what we're talking about here. What is what is the likelihood of success, right?
Very low. It's very low, Jim. Okay. It's very low. I could say this till I'm blue in the face. People still try to get people to do it off the side of their desks, but existing revenue, existing clients will always be more urgent than new product innovation. So you have to have separate people do them. And I mean, unless like your business came to a screeching halt in March of 2020, which actually happened to a couple of companies that I work with, and they're like, okay, well, all of our services clients just went away. I guess now we're going to make this, product pivot we've been talking about. But that's very rare. And hopefully this is, a once in our lifetime event that we've been through. So in order to be successful, it requires dedicated resources, dedicated people. And this is one that, again, I just see so many organizations try to make it part of somebody's job as opposed to their entire job, and it's not successful. And you can start with just one person. And then there are lots of different things that you can outsource, but you need one person waking up every morning thinking about this as their highest priority.
You said something there that I want to hone in on a little bit. You said, hopefully that this was a once in a lifetime event. And for me, I immediately went to the concept of disruption. That's not once in a lifetime event.
No, I was talking about COVID. Hopefully COVID, it wasn't once in a lifetime.
Exactly. Yeah. But look at the variants. Well, that's yet another, event. Look at what's next. I mean, we've had Ebola, we've had, H1N1, we've had,
True.
What's next? Yeah. So,
thanks, Jim. I'm an optimist.
Well, okay. So, but there's the thing, we can choose to hide on the rock, right? We can. However, I think when we start looking at, new age and new thinking and productization and the pathway and things like that, it's, we've said it, the whole continuous process, the continuous effort, the dedication, I think if you're not doing that, you just might as well cash out.
Totally agree. Yeah. Innovation is a muscle that almost every CEO wants their organization to build. And that could be innovating new products, innovating new services, innovating new ways of operating. But yeah, I mean, when you survey CEOs and you ask them what are, 3 most important competencies for the next 10 years, innovation's always in the top 3. So I totally agree. And I think a lot of executives agree with you as well. I think the where the rubber meets the road is like actually putting the money behind it to be successful and approaching it in a way that is a place of curiosity and learning as opposed to like knowing and certainty.
Yeah. And that gets into that whole, fear-based motivations. It's like, well, if we don't do this, we're going under. If that is one of your primary, objectives to curb or prevent extinction, that's going to have different factors associated with it in regards to your decision making. I think that whole curiosity in the curious mind, that has to be, a very important, element. So, and you talk about principles, right? And you highlight principles to keep in mind. And so you actually say that there's 3 product innovation principles. What are they?
Yep. So the first one is think big, but start small. And that gets back to that mistake of starting too big or too perfectly. So we want to think big, right? We want to think about, that big, hairy, audacious goal and how wonderful our business is going to be, our lives are going to be when we hit it. But in order to get there, it's a series of very small steps, and it's a lot of learning along the way. So we want to start with the end in mind, but we can't just take that giant leap at once. We've got to break it down. So that's the first innovation principle. The second one is to follow urgent and expensive problems. So because I mentioned a lot of organizations develop products in search of solutions or products that no one really needs or wants to pay for, following those urgent and expensive customer problems is a key innovation principle. And then the third one, just what you were talking about, Jim, is to be fearless, to not let fear of failure hold you back from experimenting, to not let fear of cannibalization hold you back from launching a new product, to not let fear of embarrassment. Again, it gets back to failure. Like, what will my team think of me if we go down this path and it's not successful? There's a lot of fear that holds organizations back from making the right decisions in order to innovate and grow.
As you're talking, I also started looking and thinking about some of the statistics associated with, creative thinking and innovation and all of that. And what it appears that a lot of organizations are doing in order, I'm not saying that they're doing it correctly at all, but they're trying to solve these urgent and complex problems and grow their business through pure just acquisition. But to me, it seems like that creates some other dynamics that could, even prevent us from going down the productization path. Can you talk a little bit about growth, and if I take the approach through acquisition and how it impacts what you actually are working with in regards to the pathway?
Yeah, happy to. So the first thing I want to say is that I think that acquisition can be an intelligent way to solve customer problems, but it certainly shouldn't be the only way to solve new customer problems. And what I mean by that is that there are organizations who, quite frankly, Jim, are playing a lot of catch up. And they're just too far behind in terms of their digital acumen, in terms of their capabilities, that it's going to take them too long to build something themselves. So they need to go out and either buy it or partner to get it to market. Now, they may have, great brand equity in this space. They may have a great customer list and channels, and going out and acquiring the technology can be a very intelligent decision. So I don't want to say I'm anti-acquisition. In fact, with a lot of our clients, we're like, there's some technology out there that you should just go buy rather than trying to replicate it yourself. That said, acquisitions can be very tricky, and integrating acquisitions can be very tricky. So that has to be considered as part of the risk of going down that. But it is important to know that if an organization is really playing catch up, it may make sense to just go out and acquire the technology rather than building it yourself.
Yeah, that's yet a whole nother series of books associated with how to be successful through growing through acquisition. Okay, so now I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about, B2B sales, B2B marketing, B2B, rev gen, and I start, looking at all of that in regards to, where we are today, going into 2022 and beyond. Mm-hmm. What should a B2B digital marketer and a B2B, salesperson and rev gen person really need to be asking themselves?
Yeah. So the first thing is, what urgent and expensive customer problems do I see? Hopefully you've got a great pulse on the market. And if you don't, you should. And you're in a great position to see those urgent and expensive customer problems and to ask the 5 whys. So you get to the root cause. You don't just get to the surface, and then go back to the executive team and say, look, here are some needs that I think, we could solve, because again, we have brand equity in this space. Like we already have the relationships with them. They already trust our brand. But there's an unmet need that I think we could solve. Could we go and explore it? So I think sales and marketing is a great source for what are urgent and expensive customer problems that need solving.
Okay, so let's turn this a little bit and look at it a different way as well. Okay. You are doing services. You created a productized book. You're talking about moving up the particular ladder. How are you doing that for yourself?
Oh, I love that question. So yeah, it's like, are we drinking our own champagne, right? Yeah. That's what you want to know, Jim. Yes, ma'am. So I am about to, you'd be so proud of me, make an offer to a general manager to run the new product that is to teach organizations the method that we outline in the book. So it will be start as a productized service, but the goal then is that there's a technology overlay to help organizations continue to follow the process after we leave the building or leave the virtual Zoom room. And I know, because I've been working with organizations, and I just told you, like, you have to make it a dedicated person's job. So about to make an offer to a GM to do this. It's in beta right now. So we've gotten feedback from our beta customers. We went out and did a bunch of concept testing over the summer. So we have a pretty good sense of which features are most important and willingness to pay. So we are trying as hard as we can, Jim, to drink our own champagne.
Okay. So talking about that very expensive, problem, I also start thinking about this whole skill set thing. I keep going back to the whole, let's think about this, because I've, for the past several years, I've looked at, a lot of studies and I interviewed a lot of people on my other podcast, the Fast Leader Show. And, we've looked at this whole creative thinking and innovation issue. And I've innovated, and I've had the blessing of interviewing like the top 10 people in the innovation world. And I always refer to a lot of their books, like here's one right here that I would recommend to everybody. Doug Hall, Driving Eureka. If you don't have this book, you need to get that book. And there's several others. We actually did an ebook about 13 other interviews that we have done in regards to creative thinking and innovation. And the fact is, the statistics don't lie. Our educational system and what has happened over the past, 10, 15 years in regards to digital, let's just say addiction, the creative thinking skills in the marketplace have plummeted to crisis levels. And so for me, that's kind of like the burgeoning ground and element when we start talking about where's the soil. We need to have some of these basic skills. So, okay, fundamental marketplace problem for your productized solution. Well, we have people who just really, they've never exercised that muscle, right? How do we get them to be able to do that for themselves so that they can do that for you see how this cascading effect starts happening. If that's the BHAG to me, maybe I'm wrong, and I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah. So I had a great professor in business school who had spent her career researching creativity. And what I learned in her class is that creativity can be taught. And that it's not innate, because a lot of people talk about, oh, she's so creative, right? But creativity is a muscle that can be developed over time. And the best way that I have seen to develop that muscle, two things. One is to go very, very broad in exposure. So the way that you get great ideas is you get divergent thinking and you start to see patterns between things that are seemingly unrelated. But in order to do that, you have to read broadly, talk broadly, watch broadly. So people who are just reading, business books or one section of the New York Times, or, they only read the front couple pages of, and now I'm dating myself because I'm talking about pages, right, of the Wall Street Journal each morning, or whatever it is, they're going to be less creative because they're not going broad. If you only talk to the same types of people or the same types of customers or the customers who just love you, you're not going to get exposed to those different ideas. So going broad is one thing that I've seen really work in helping people to spot those seemingly unrelated patterns. The second one is that test and learn methodology and mindset. And that's why it's so important to start small. Because if you think I've got to come up with the next iPhone, right? That huge, big idea, I'm not Steve Jobs, neither are you. But what we can do is identify a really small problem that we see, go talk to a lot of people, do some broad exposure, test it, and then come back and see, were we right? So it's really thinking like a scientist. And I advise organizations who are trying to find these people is to go out and look for people who are used to doing hypothesis-based research, come up with a hypothesis, design a test, see what happened, continue to refine. Because that test and learn mindset is so critical for ultimately down the road coming up with that new iPhone idea.
So you opened up yet another Pandora's box in regards to divergent and convergent thinking. And that in itself, oh my gosh. Okay. Gosh, but unfortunately, our time is up for today.
Oh, darn. We could talk all day, Jim.
I think so. Okay, but I've had a great time talking with you, Aisha. If you could, please tell the B2B DM gang how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah. So my company's name is Vectorous, and we are at www.vectorous.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Eisha Tierney Armstrong. And then the book is Productized. You can find it anywhere you get your books.
Aisha Tierney, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Oh, thank you, Jim. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Go now to join the B2B DM gang in the B2B Marketer LinkedIn group, where you can connect with other B2B DM disruptors and get access to our B2B DM cheat sheets, checklist, and guides. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, please help by going to iTunes to rate, review, and subscribe. And share the show on all of your digital platforms. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode. And always remember, you can automate your lead capture, but you must lure your lead.